But if you're like me and you're here for a fun and complex but still approachable city builder with some RTS elements, that's what you're getting, and it does it very well.
Manor Lords is a gorgeous medieval city builder that kept me occupied for hours building my perfect cozy hamlets.
I can't stop playing it, to be honest with you.
Is the game overhyped? I would say yes.
April of 2024. That will always be one of my favorite months because it is when one of the coolest new games came out. That was Manor Lords, but since it's been 6 months since its release, I wanted to actually go over how the last 6 months have been and really a critique of the game itself, talking about the ups and the downs because I haven't really touched upon some of the issues that Manor Lords does have and, well, really its vision for the future, which I think at the moment is my main sticking point. I mean, the game was a fantastic success for Hooded Horse and Slavic Magic, who was originally the solo developer. Now, granted, other people came on to help, a lot of freelance people, and I think the team is starting to grow into something a bit more substantial now, which is highly recommended because whilst doing everything on your own with freelancers means that you can keep your vision, eventually you're going to need extra, well, helping hands, and it does seem that Manor Lords does need that at this point in time. The game is absolutely gorgeous. It is one of the best looking titles, and in fact, I actually think that is one of the main selling points for the game itself. People will come into this for sure a city builder mixed with its combat side, which we'll get onto in a little bit, but actually it was the visuals and the look of the game that I think made people attracted to it in the first place. Being able to go down into third person and roam around was a nice little touch, but most of it from the top down, even just zooming in and watching your men do their battles or even just going around their villages, everybody each having their own jobs, from woodcutters to hunters, skinning the animals, and all the animations are so intricately done. Everybody's life seems to be moving despite you being there or not. And I think this is one of the main aspects that I personally fell in love with. It did feel like you were involved with this living and breathing medieval village. Things like the road building, absolutely fantastic. The way that they lock onto each other, and of course it looks so incredibly realistic. When it starts to rain, the puddles fill up and it starts to get muddy, and is one of the most successful medieval simulators that I've seen, full stop. Upgrading your town, of course, is gorgeous and the natural way that you'd expect it to look, from your level 1 houses that are basically wood and straw thatch huts to eventually getting to level 3 where you're starting to get more things like harder building materials, brick, that kind of clay being researched. And this is all shown throughout, seeing the progression of your villages. However, it's not all perfect, and unfortunately this video is going to be more critiquing the game and some of the things that I have noticed through the last 6 months of gameplay that, in fact, I think should be talked about at some point. One of the first things is actually upgrading your towns. Whilst it looks fantastic as you're doing it, it can be somewhat frustrating, and whilst this has been fixed in various patches in the last 6 months, there are still some issues. The main issue is when you're upgrading, you need to check off a few things for the people or the residents of these houses to be happy. Everything from having a water supply to having a variety of food, different types of clothing, and later on a tavern supply. But a lot of the times when you do have these things, the villagers don't actually register them on the market. They might be too far away or just outside the capture zone, or sometimes it just takes a bit of time for them to see, oh, there's 3 types of food here, I'm now ready to upgrade. It's an interesting and a bit of an odd way of doing it, especially since the rest of the game has tried to be so realistic and tried to be as authentically historical as possible. It seems like a very jilted, arcadey way of making sure people are ready to be upgraded to that next stage. So how do you fix this? So you can have your central market, and of course you have your residential places around them. There was then added in the addition to turn on and off the ability for resource collection dumps to put down market stalls. So obviously the best way to do it, make sure all your resource collections like lumber yards, berry pickers, hunters can't make markets, so they can just focus on their jobs, and you put the markets down via the granary or of course the storehouses. So it was a slight fix. It's still not perfect, but it has been somewhat tweaked. Not just this, but one of the biggest ones was the tavern supply, trying to get up to the level 3 houses. Barley was so hard to plant in most areas, which means you'd have to import it. It's very expensive, and of course making beer from this barley would be even more expensive. Now it's been slightly changed where it's kind of a 1-to-1. One barley makes one malt, which makes one beer. It's somewhat fixed, however, the underlying issues are still there. A lot of the times you'll be in regions where you just can't plant barley. There's no fertility. And it means that getting to level 3 houses is almost impossible in any sort of sufficient time. And it kind of makes that game loop, what could have been fun and realistic, somewhat frustrating, at least for me. Because most of your towns should feel like they're ready. Or, for example, you've got so many resources, but they're not quite in the right capture area, so you're not able to upgrade. It feels a bit odd. One of the biggest selling points of Manor, and I think what got people on side in the first place, is that transition between building your villages and the combat, which is great, and it does work pretty well. Of course, you have brigands that can come in and you can get your guys to defend them. I love the way that when you're building weapons, you will have your villagers, once they're recruited into units, going into the storehouses, picking up spears and bows and crossbows and taking them back to their houses. So when they're called to arms, they can run into their house quickly and pick up their arms and go back to form up. It's a really nice touch, and the bell rings and everybody storms out of their houses. I love that. Every time it happens, I've got to zoom in just to see what's going on. But when it comes to the actual battles themselves, it still feels very, very lackluster. It's very shallow. Of course, we were never expecting something like a really in-depth RTS mechanic here, but it does feel like what could have been still hasn't quite been touched upon when it comes to combat. There was a lot of talk on the build-up of terrain details, like archers being less effective in trees, or fighting up and downhill depends on how well your troops fare in terms of fatigue, and whilst I'm sure that does come into play, it doesn't really seem to have much of an effect on the overall battle. Especially against bandits, you pretty much can slaughter them every time, even if you just have 1-to-1 troops, or even if you're slightly outnumbered. And then it's pretty much about numbers. Archers are famously not very effective within the game. They've been buffed a little bit. Crossbows have kind of balanced that out, but once again, they're now quite expensive to build with having iron parts and things, and that's a finite resource once more. There is no cavalry within the game, which is understood that that's probably quite a tricky thing to be added into the title, but because of the map's kind of small at this point in time, I think cavalry would be so overpowered and overwhelm anybody that actually tries to fight you, because the AI just isn't that effective. It isn't that smart at this point in time. And all this provides an interesting combat experience, but a little bit lackluster. It doesn't feel like this is the focus of the game. And to be fair, it isn't the focus of the game. You can very much tell that this was always intended to be a city building game, but it's in there. So I would like to see it expanded and fleshed upon at some point in time, and I'm sure that's something that's being worked on. Because the real crux of Manor is you're not paying for a finished title. I mean, it's still pretty expensive on Steam for the content that you get. Coming in at £35 or around $40, I would say it probably doesn't have £35 worth of content within the game. As somebody that has pretty much made their recent career on this title, I have about 40 hours in the game, and I've pretty much done everything that I can without just repeating myself over and over again. Now, 40 hours is a good amount of time to put into a game. I think there will be a lot of people watching this who will be surprised at that low number. And that's not necessarily because I have anything against the title, but it's because I've done everything that I want to do at this point in time, and every time I go back, it's just to record more gameplay like you're seeing on screen, but doing pretty much the same game loop. It's not necessarily the biggest thing in the world, because what is in the game has been so well refined and is pretty well polished, but there is a serious lack of content that I think if most people who aren't recording for YouTube videos will probably get around 15 to 20 hours of content without feeling like they're just repeating themselves. Now, the new game modes will be coming in at some point, and I'm sure we'll be getting in new maps, but what I'm trying to say is this is all potential for the future. The current game itself still does feel like early access, which was entirely the plan from the start, but I think something that is worth mentioning to anybody that hasn't picked up the title itself. There is no real mod support at this moment in time, which is to be expected, but it does mean that there isn't really much in terms of community content on the way. There is bits here and there. They're mostly small little fixes. In terms of actual content, there's nothing that's really going to completely change your game. But the issue is, for me, I'm not sure where it's going. I'm very much under the impression that this is a work in progress and that we are paying into the potential. So if you want to play Manor, you're really just doing it to support the developer and to get a decent but not feature complete title, which I think is fair enough and very understandable. And I would say for the amount of high quality work that's been put into the game is admirable. Having a title that is made by one sole developer, later on bringing on freelancers, but never really forming like a huge team, has its kind of admirable qualities. And it was sort of that David versus Goliath moment that really helped promote the game. And I think it was a really smart way of actually Hooded Horse, who later picked up as the publishing house, promoted this game as that solo developed project. Be or end all, it's not technically true these days, but I think that could be in the long term is downfall. The most important thing is keeping the vision, which I think Slavic Magic has proven themselves to be a talented and incredibly driven developer that anybody that comes onto that team surely will be under the impression that we're going in this guy's direction. But having the extra help in order to make this a fully feature-fleshed game is so important for this title to be, well, around in the next year or so to come, because I'm sure there is so much that people would like, but isn't quite in the title. For one, cavalry, a bit more in-depth diplomacy mechanics, which is very, very lacking. The fact that you can't really do much in terms of talking to other AI, and even then, not even having AI that build their own little villages that you can then trade with or go to war with. These would all be really nice touches that would flesh out the game so much more than it already is. But as a player and as a consumer, I'm not entirely sure what the vision for the game is at this point in time. Is it a village builder with some kind of light combat mechanics, or is this going to turn into something a bit more fleshed out, a full diplomacy trading simulator with having other villages and AI that can interact with you? Because if that's the vision, I would absolutely love that. But of course, that is incredibly optimistic for the size and scale that the team's working on at this point in time. But I don't know what the vision is, and I think that is probably a bit of an issue, because the game released in a state that I was overwhelmed with, and I thought it was one of the most incredible new indie titles. And now I'm excited to see what's next, but I'm not sure what it is. The combat is a nice addition, but it feels like a bit of an unfulfilled hint, or even just a tease at what could be something really huge. And it hasn't quite been executed to that satisfying level yet. It's like being blueballed by a 10 out of 10. You know, you could be onto something incredible here, but all we're getting at this point in time is the odd wink. And honestly, it's very frustrating. But hey, eventually we might get to take them bowling at some point. I don't know where that analogy went. I think this video is definitely focused on more of the negatives of Manor Lords, and I think there is a lot of positives within the game. Actually, it's overwhelmingly positive. I think the title really lived up to what the core majority of its fans were expecting. There are obviously a few outliers that might have been expecting something way bigger. However, for the conservative future, I'd like to see what's next. I'd like to see some sort of roadmap and really talk about the vision, because there have been some great updates, things adding in like crossbows, going on to Unreal Engine 5, and that being an indicator of some much bigger things in the future. But at this point in time, I don't know what it is, and I would love to, because, well, I'd love to see what the future of Manor Lords is going to be.